We all want to get to Everest. Everest is like the fully actualized media plan where we have millions of dollars towards search, offline, everything in between, right? And we hold space that we're not going to get here today, right? I'm not going to be successful if I go to the executive board and say, I need $10 million for TV. The most valuable currency for SMBs is not money itself. It's usually time, right? They would gladly spend money on a tool that helps them do X if it allows them to do Y, Z, A, B, other tasks that they have to do faster, right? Everyone that's a B2B SaaS advertises on affiliate marketing, on LinkedIn, right? And they're all targeting very similar people, like high net worth decision maker individuals. And there is clutter.
Hey, welcome to the Message Market Fit podcast. I'm your host, Chris Silvestri. And if you're new here, this is a show where I chat with B2B SaaS folks in marketing, product, growth, and founders about how they join the conversation already happening in their customers' minds. We dive deep into their thinking, their systems, and their playbooks to see how they empathize with their audience and speak to them in a way that resonates, so they're compelled to take action. Join us and learn how you too can shape your messaging strategy and write copy that truly resonates and differentiates you. Today's episode is very cool. I'm chatting with Brandon Lutz, a B2B offline advertising expert who has worked with several well-known technology brands including Indeed, Miro, and Amazon. In this episode, we chat about the undervalued role of offline media in B2B SaaS marketing, how to adapt messaging across different cultures and markets, brand awareness versus performance in offline campaigns, and much more. Let's dive right in. Hey, Brandon. Thanks so much for being here. Welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's exciting to be here.
I want to start with kind of a broad question, but especially since it's not my area of expertise, you're in offline media, right? What fascinates you about offline media?
Yeah, so I think it's important to go back into where I started, both from a study and a communication standpoint. So when I, ages ago, left university, right, a lot of the conversations were really around digital marketing, right? Especially in the tech world, right? That's where everything was being focused on. And a lot of people's career emphasis really put on getting a job in emerging social media, in SEO and affiliates and paid search. And what I found interesting is I knew I wanted to work more in the tech world, but offline advertising just wasn't a large component to that conversation. And so I did start my career at IBM working more in the digital social space, but I did enjoy previous experiences working on the agency side in offline media. So things like television, out of home, radio, direct mail. It's a really undervalued, I think, set of media tactics in B2B SaaS world, which I now sit in. So I love that it's more mass media. I enjoy that it's more of a challenge to measure, I think, both from the communication standpoint, like the messaging standpoint, but also depending on whether you're a performance or brand-based marketer, I think it's challenging to measure. But nevertheless, I think especially today when a lot of sort of brands are being commoditized and there's a lot of clutter online, the question is, how do I reach people when they're not at their computer or they're coming up for air for their phone? And I think offline media has a huge role to play in those communication issues. And that's really what's interesting to me about it.
Awesome. And currently you work at Miro, right? Which, like any tech company, is very centered around there's a lot of digital ads, digital communication, messaging. So how does offline media fit into that ecosystem at Miro?
Yeah, so you're right. Hit the nail on the head. Miro is a B2B SaaS product. We call ourselves the innovation workspace. So our target audience are really individuals that work in product development teams, right? So from early stage discovery of a problem or a product for the full product development cycle into the actual release of something either digital or physical, right? We feel like Miro has a part to play in that story. And a lot of our work is focused more on digital, right? Just by nature of being a digital tool. And even when I started 3 years ago, a lot of the messaging focus and the tactic were really what I would say is bottom of funnel focused. We really relied on capturing was like latent demand for tools like ours, again, just tied to the pandemic and people needing remote software. And we didn't really necessarily need to focus a lot on going above top of funnel channels and messaging because people were searching for a product that they already knew they needed. They needed a remote working tool that we were offering, right? But as we moved away from pandemic, the conversations around our messaging and reach changed. The bottom of funnel, we were realizing, is not an infinite space, right? There's people who are searching for what they need. And then there's still the individuals that form the majority of our total addressable market that we're not communicating to. And that's even just like being problem aware, right? Yeah. And how to deal with that. And then there's all the different levers of vertical specific, company size specific, and why it's important for the story of how we do above the line and offline at Miro is that the messaging that we talk about at this level or at these channels is very different from the communication that we would have when someone's ready to purchase or ready to sign up, right? And so my role, in addition to the media strategy, is helping take the messaging that our product marketing teams develop and how do we express that into, say, a 60-second podcast ad or on a billboard, right? And how can we communicate something pretty complex in a very simplified way that gets end users to say, okay, I get it, I understand, I want to try it.
Yeah, super interesting. And I wanted to ask, because in a lot of the messaging that I do for B2B SaaS, there's a lot of considerations around the decision-making unit, right? So decision makers, users, check signers, influencers. So how do you address these types of different decision makers with offline media, if that's something that you think about at all?
Yeah. So I think what's really fascinating about offline, and again, it's a really big tent, right? So offline can be something super broad, like television or terrestrial radio. It could be very niche, like a trade publication, right? So holding space that it's a huge set of tactics, but nevertheless, there is a role that this sort of broad channel spectrum can play, whether you're talking to end users or decision makers, right? When I think about messaging or when it comes to both audiences, they focus on different things. And so an example of this is, so Miro is an innovation workspace, right? We believe that companies can move faster, build products faster when they use Miro. But the question becomes, okay, like how do we express innovation in a way that matters to both groups, end users and decision makers? What we find is that when it comes to decision maker communication, the concerns about innovation are a lot more explicit, right? There are concerns about the speed that their businesses can move. There's concerns about going to market quicker. There's competitive pressure. And so the need for innovation or innovative tools to change the way that their teams work is a lot more readily established in their brain, right? And they're trying to save, and it's very sort of broader business questions, right? That like a CIO or a chief product officer would care about. In my opinion, and I'm speaking for myself here, right? When you get down to the end user, innovation is nice, but it's not necessarily the thing that they're focused on, right? If I'm a product manager, I'm looking for a tool that can help me take research notes from qualitative studies and help me make a product brief really quickly with that, right? And there's time that is taken to look at all these notes, make connections, create similarities, and build structured documents from unstructured format. That's a very different set of decisions, but innovation does have a theme to play here. It's a lot more under the radar, right? So decision makers, innovation can be a very topical thing that they care about and we can focus messaging on. From an end user, it's focused on how can I make my job that I have to do more productive, more collaborative, and that is where innovation is tied. I don't know if that sort of answers the question, but that's how I'd see it.
Yeah, sure. And I also wanted to ask, because you mentioned that taking the messaging that product marketing creates and then adapting it to offline media. Is that always the flow, the sequence, or does it happen that the offline media message also informs product marketing as well?
Yeah, so what's cool about what I've been able to do with my product marketing team is it operates as a circle, right? So I'd say the genesis of messaging really comes from product marketing, right? They will conduct the research. They're working with product to understand what our customers care about, what feedback they're getting on products and features, And that's developing how we should go to market with certain products and features and how we talk about that and communicate that, right? But what's good is you can always do that in a contained environment, like a research study. But also what's nice about offline advertising, let's say I'm doing programmatic podcast advertising, is it creates an environment where we can test these messages in the wild and correct feedback to show product marketing, hey, our assumptions about the way that we're talking about a particular feature is going well or not going well. Or this pain point seems to be getting a lot more attention. And that directly goes back and feeds into product marketing, who then helps create GTN documentation for sales team. It's really like a proper circle. And I think that's how it should be done.
Yeah. And what kind of data do you collect to gauge the interest or the results that you get from messaging? What's the attribution there?
It depends on the channels. Again, so I think what's hard about offline is that it can be difficult to measure, right? You're dealing with a lot of channels that aren't click-based, and so you're making assumptions based off of either third-party research. When you're in closed environments, like when you hear this ad or you're going to listen to a series of ads, what is being pulled out of their mind, what's coming to mind? Or we can do, if there's an in-between channel, again, like a programmatic audio channel, we can use pixel-based tracking to look at people who are exposed to a particular creative ad. Their mobile ad ID or an IP address is logged, and then we can see within a certain window, either like visiting of the website or a conversion event with the same IP address or the same mobile ID, and you can match both sides. I think both are important and valuable. And so how we integrate both, right, is every time we do programmatic advertising or audio, I will always wind up making 2 to 3 ads per campaign, right? And we're going after different use cases or different focuses. Because again, we want to understand what's resonating and what's not. I think it's more of a risk to go all in with just one message. So in this case, we'll look at different features and solutions. Before we go to market, we'll actually pre-test sort of the copy or startup. So we lo-fi do a recording. We'll pre-test these audio ads in a controlled environment. And we'll see what's coming up for people, right? The first and most important thing we care about is brand recall high? Do they know who the brand is that's being mentioned on the audio ad? Important for us. And then after that, right, what are they taking away from pain points? Can they identify with, or do they find the pain point resonant? And then finally, the sort of reason to believe, right? How are we articulating a product in a way that's tied back to the pain point that they care about? And we use that as a pre-check on our side to say, okay, do we need to change the script up? If they can't recall the brand very well at all, or if that score's low, that usually means that we probably stand to add more mentions of the brand than we currently have. And we might do that at the beginning. In the middle, we might spell it out. At the end, we do a call to action. But that's the most important thing. If people don't remember the brand, I think the biggest problem. But then after that, we start looking at, if we play around with a more, let's say, aspirational pain point or value, do we feel like that matters? Or do we see that people really care about the more tangible pain points that they deal with? We use that to inform our creative, and then we'll re-record, we'll put them all into market. And then once they're live, we'll look at how the site visit, the conversions play out in real time. And at the end of the campaign, we'll look to see if there's any statistically significant differences in traffic or conversion coming from different ads. And that feeds into the next round of creative that we make, and the cycle kind of continues.
When it comes to those internal like pre-tests that you run, are those like focus groups that you have people listen to the message and ask questions?
Yeah, so what we'll do is we'll usually use like a third party that does it online. So we'll set the target audience that we care about, and they will search for individuals who pre-opt into participating in these kind of surveys who match a profile that we care about. So this can be job titles, it can be lines of business, right? It's really up to you, depending on what your product or service is, and who you want to be testing the ads against. If it's an end user, we want to make sure that they represent the lines of business that we care about, or the job function that we care about, because they're our most important customer.
Yeah, makes sense. And it's like usability testing or message testing for audio or other forms of media. It's super interesting.
Yeah, and I think what's great is that it's also a sense check on are we getting too in the weeds at this level of messaging? I think what's really interesting is we know our product really well, and we're all very passionate about Miro. We could talk about it for days, especially for someone that's not exposed to the product yet. I think what's good about the work that we're doing in offline and the sort of pre-testing we're doing is that it helps sense check if we're coming in a bit too hot with like too many things at once, right?
Yeah.
And again, you only have 30 to 60 seconds on an audio ad. Do we need to pull it back a little bit? Not because we don't think it's important, but just like we have very limited attention and time. The goal is to instill curiosity that leads them to go on the website and learn more in depth about all these things. So how do we maybe simplify? I think it's like a huge sense check for us that we can be complex sometimes in our communications and offline.
Yeah, and I suspect probably one of the toughest things about conducting those tests is also finding the right questions to ask and avoid leading people to like the right answer, because that was what happens to me when I like write user tests or message tests. So how do you try to ask the right pointed questions without leading them to the actual solution?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the most important thing is I accept in myself that my background personally is not in data and sort of statistics. I lean on the people or the partners that we work with who have the experience precisely to ensure that we don't ask leading questions like that. Maybe it's instead of priming a question like which of the following SaaS brands did you hear about in the ad, you're asking which of the following brands, because if you're priming them to hear, it could give you a false reading of how the messaging is actually coming out. Because again, I think it's important, like if they're completely not even getting the category correctly and they're mentioning a totally random brand, that's a huge thing to diagnose and understand. But I think the other thing is from just like another way to avoid that bias, I think is coming into these kinds of experiments completely open to the fact that the creative or messaging that you made may flop. It may do well, it may flop, right? Like don't have so much emotional attachment to the ads you make. I think that also can lead to bias, because if you want something to succeed, you might subconsciously frame questions to get that result you want. I think you really have to just be open to the fact that it might not resonate. And it doesn't mean that it's not going to eventually, but just your assumptions about your audience and what matters to them might be very different from the reality.
All right. So I wanted to ask if you, when it comes to creating offline media from product marketing, messaging, for example, landing page, or you have an ad somewhere, LinkedIn, for example, do you have a framework to turn that messaging into offline media messaging? How does it work?
Yeah. I'll take a previous experience. So not Miro, but at Indeed. So the job website company. When I was working at Indeed, I was responsible for our sort of SMB offline messaging across Europe. So the question was, again, we have a set of tools and features to get SMBs to post their jobs on Indeed in markets that are largely lower awareness of the job board industry. And so the question is, how do we do that? What we did at Indeed, before we started looking at country by country nuances, is we always started with the research, right? And we called it like our universal Bible of SMB research. We took a huge global study of the things that SMBs really care about, right? And just to challenge our assumptions, right? And see if they aligned with what was consistent in the US. And what we found, which was largely the same, is that SMBs, when it came to hiring, or even just in general, like the most valuable currency for SMBs is not money itself. It's usually time, right? They would gladly spend money on a tool that helps them do X if it allows them to do X, Y, Z, or Y, Z, A, B, other tasks that they have to do faster, right? When it came to hiring, money was not often a function of concern for them. The concern was, I have to hire quickly. If I do a job site, I have 100 resumes or CVs that get put on my lap. I need to chop this down to 10, and then I'm more than happy to look at the 10 really qualified people. So this nugget of insight drove, one, how do we talk about the pain points in communications? In radio advertising or TV, we're going to focus in on the value of time as being the overarching thing that SMBs care about. When it goes into reasons to believe, right? So how does Indeed make that possible for you? We'll say, okay, you want to save time. You want to get you from 100 resumes to 10 resumes. right? Here's things called Indeed assessments or Indeed screener questions that you can add, right? It allows you to basically have some pre-designed questions, right? If you have certain certifications, if you speak certain languages, certain competencies. And the point of that is to automatically slice out those individuals that just don't have the qualifications that you need. And that's a very tangible ad that we would do and run, right? And that's how we would take research as it into the core messaging. And then the next question was, how do we localize it for cultural nuance in both the market, but also in advertising, right? Because how you market in Germany, if you try an American style ad there, it's probably not going to do as well, maybe versus somewhere in the UK, which are much more comfortable with that communication.
Yeah, makes sense. And what are some examples of a message that you've seen was drastically different between different cultures and that you had to adapt?
Yeah, I'll use the Indeed example. And I think it's interesting, right? And I'm also going to hold my hands up and say, I am American. So this is, as an American living in Europe, right? I speak a few languages, but I've lived in a couple of different countries. And so you can pick out the cultural nuances that exist everywhere. I think what's interesting, let's say about the Netherlands, culturally, in my experience of like marketing to SMBs, I think culturally the Netherlands is really open to new ideas. I think there's like a historical context for this. And so the uptake of new tools and trying new things, they're very open to it. I think cost was maybe more of a focus for them as well. But largely speaking, we could take the US style mindset of our creative, be the first to get the right quality candidates, try something new, be innovative. This is a new way of hiring. And it was largely receptive, right? We could usually just essentially localize with minimal changes into Dutch, and it would relatively well for the market. I think when it comes to a market like France or Germany, I think, and maybe Germany I'll use more specifically, right? I think there tends to be let's say, like the risk aversion is higher, right? So trying something new can be very difficult for businesses, I think, in that region. And I think because it's really down to this idea of better the devil versus the one you don't, right? There was a lot of research and signals that were telling us that German SMBs would rather take the thing that's currently that they're using, even if it's painful, than something new, because they understand this thing. It's painful, but I know, right?
Yeah.
This thing could be so much worse.
Switching costs, yeah.
Yeah, and almost want to be the first. They wanted to have it be tried and tested, where it was focused on. So how that might influence our messaging, and I'll bring it back down to a digital standpoint, right? In our website activity, in most of our ads, we would say the world #1 job site. We have X number of users globally. But for Germany, we really focused in and say that number at the time, that global number, just isn't resonant to them. They want to know that we understand the business in Germany, right? So we would localize everything and say X number of German businesses, German SMBs use Miro, or there are X number of Germans, job seekers visiting. When we had landing pages, especially for enterprise, we would constantly prefer to have the German logos on the page because, again, it was a signal to that audience that tends to be risk averse. Oh, they're doing this with German businesses. They understand our market a bit more. I'm more receptive now. I don't have to be the first one to do it. So that's an example of how two markets that are next to each other might be receptive to messaging in completely different ways.
Yeah, it's getting there. You're putting the door. You have to let them embrace the idea first before convincing them.
Yeah, and especially, again, like American tech companies may or may not have a level of suspicion when they enter a market like Europe. And so I think a huge work that these businesses have to do is if you're coming into a market like Europe, the most important thing that I've ever learned and understood is Europe is a huge microcosm of different places. And to assume that how Italy and Italians think about products and services is very different from the French, which is very different from the Nordics. And you have to be really respectful of that and adapt accordingly as you need to. Like Germany or France, you probably have to do a lot of work to make sure that things are properly localized in the languages, the messaging resonates. Maybe you don't need to prioritize it as quickly, say, for the Nordics, okay, with English or like US-based tech.
So let's say that a company can't afford to have 1,000 different personalized messages or variants, but wants to be able to speak to Western Europe in general. What would you advise them to do?
Yeah. So my I think it's important, obviously, to have the business has a core sense of what its strategic markets are, right? You can't market to everybody, but I think it's important if you're in charge of messaging and campaigns to understand where the business is planning to invest, right? There's no point in getting something localized for Greece if that's not a strategic market.
Yeah.
So I think that's the first sort of area, is just having an understanding of what are the strategic geos that you care about. The second thing is, if product marketing or research or whomever does research in your business is compiling this information, do what you can, whether it's with your existing customer base or outside of your customer base, to get a sampling, even if it's a smaller sample size, that includes the strategic geos that you care about. Because obviously you want the holistic number to be of value, but also, do you have enough of a breakout for just a market to see if there's a difference, even if it's directional? I think even if like you're in startup mode, directional signals can still be useful for you.
Yeah.
And see if there's nuance here in what you're caring about. And then I think the third thing is, you're right. You're not going to be able to prioritize messaging or hire 1,000 different copywriters, right? And this is where the startup mindset comes into place. If you're selling into France, you probably do have a French salesperson, or I'd say you should, and bring them in as a part of that process, right? They might not be a copywriter by trade, but help them or bring them in to help them at least make the communication sound like it's coming from a native speaker. I think it's really important, right? And again, it's all in startup world to prove out that this market has legs, has potential, and that can help you in the future with justifying expenses to doing more research there, hiring local marketers there. It just depends.
Yeah, totally. We spoke about awareness of the audience, and I was wondering, how do you balance offline media, especially the message between brand awareness and performance? What are the main differences there that you consider?
So when it comes to performance marketing, I think ultimately you're always seeking to understand a more simplistic set of metrics that maybe B2B companies are more comfortable with, which is the channel driving a tangible business metric that can have an associated cost that aligns with the other channels we use, right? So paid search, you always have a cost per click or cost per acquisition target. And if you're experimenting, there's a certain line over that cost per acquisition target that you hit. You're probably going to do something similar in performance marketing if your channel is offline. How you measure, which I can get into and for days and hours, is different. But largely speaking, like, your messaging always should have a call to action in these kinds of communications. They might be very short-term problem solution focused, right? In a short period of time, are you having a trouble with X? Here's our product. Here is how you use our product to solve that problem. Try it for now, for free, get a coupon or whatever at website. And the communication there is really built on short-term business need. I think when you start going into brand advertising, the messaging goes a lot further ahead in a buyer journey, right? So it might really be about, it depends, but it can be about the problem and making people problem aware, and not necessarily talking about how the product can solve it immediately. It might be just learn more at Miro or Indeed or wherever. Or it can be more aspirational, right? This is our brand. These are what our values are. This is who we care to serve, right? And the storytelling, I think, is just a lot different. I think you're not bound by such short-term metrics with an awareness campaign. Typically, when you're using awareness media, right, changes in perception of a brand take much longer to measure over time versus short-term performance marketing. I think that is a lot of reason why you don't really see a lot of brands in B2B SaaS investing in offline. I think because just the time window to see results is just longer. And there's a sort of like reaction to say, like, if I don't see the metrics, then it's not working, which we all know as marketers, right? There's a part that's measurable and a part that's not. But yeah, the messaging is largely different. It really depends on if it's short-term focused conversion activity, have the time space to really talk about the problem over time and how your brand solves it, right?
Yeah. So what type of companies would you suggest to invest in offline media, and how and why would you suggest they do?
Yeah. So I'm a huge advocate that B2B businesses should be investing more in offline advertising. And the reason I feel so passionately about this, especially in channels like audio advertising, I think it's really important. First of all, everyone that's a B2B SaaS advertises on affiliate marketing, on LinkedIn, right? And they're all targeting very similar people, like high net worth decision maker individuals. And there is clutter. That like this is just true. People are being bombarded every which way with different SaaS tools on the internet. And it's difficult to make your brand well known and top of mind in this environment. I think what gives B2B brands a step up if they go into offline, especially in audio advertising, is like you can find a show for any which audience, right? If I want a show that's just with engineers, I can find a lot of those, right? They might not be a million people listening, but they exist. And audiences have really strong affinities to the host that they listen to. This is also backed by third-party research. And so leaning in to this kind of media tactic where you can find the right host that either knows your product already or can learn about it very quickly, that has an audience that's directly tied to who you care about, this is really largely underserved, right? I think it's a huge opportunity it's not as broad as something like TV. I'm not saying every brand should be there, right? But I think for a lot of B2B SaaS brands, I think the next step when you're looking to grow your awareness or even your conversions, I think the next step should always be, where can we do podcast or audio advertising generally? Maybe you get brave enough to do out of home. But yeah, I think that as like a line of business or an industry segment, I'm super bullish. This needs to be more looked into and invested more.
Yeah. I'm curious, especially when it comes to not only audio, but also, for example, TV ads. Do you also work on the creative, the video that comes with the actual ad? And does that relate in any way? Do you keep consistency between that visual and, for example, the digital version of an ad, for example? How does it work?
Yeah, so I'd say my background is largely in the media strategy perspective. So if we're doing, again, the companies I've worked for, whether it's YouTube or connected TV or direct mail, a large part of my interest and focus is, again, making sure that the messaging is easy to understand and we're hitting all the best practices for building an ad in this medium, depending on if it's awareness or performance based. Where I recognize that I'm not a master, is I am 100% not a creative person. And so I think it's really important to work closely and have a good relationship with your brand team, right? And constantly work through understanding the product together, because they're really the individuals that can take the product messaging and make it in a way that is distinctive. And I think that's a really important thing when it comes to any type of offline advertising. How do you be distinctive? And you can articulate that in different ways. You can teach someone a new thing. You can provide a sort of shock, and you can be funny, right? But you have to be distinctive, right? If you're just my armchair opinion is, right, like it's very easy to be like in B2B. Oh, we're a global solution for solution solving.
Yeah.
And people are like, what is this? I have no idea what this is. It's a way to show your personality. It's a way to be distinctive, right? Mean for your brand that your executive team is open for you to do something crazy and kooky that gets attention, even potentially like controversial attention, right? But be distinctive. And again, like I wouldn't necessarily be the one to create those ideas, but I'm making sure, okay, let's do the crazy thing. But is the messaging, is the ultimate sort of pain point solution still baked in there around this sort of distinctiveness that we're creating? And then is the brand they see on an audio ad consistent with what they see on a LinkedIn ad on the website, right? So it's the same company speaking to them. It doesn't seem like a bunch of different brands.
Yeah. And also for when it comes to digital, you'll have high intent, so it's easier to understand what captures attention. So how do you do it with offline media? Do you have examples of capturing attention effectively in offline media?
Yeah, so I think one thing is interesting, maybe this is like a tangible example, is we're talking about in like pre-research surveys that we would do. A couple of iterations ago, we were wrestling with this concept on, do we want to go with something that's a bit more highbrow in terms of pain points that are more aspirational versus more tangible? And so I think we essentially made two ads. One that was more about this idea of collaborating, like getting the best outcome for your team, collaborating together, working together. And there was another ad that was very much, here's how you save time, right? And the messaging was targeted towards end users. Our original assumption, I would say, is that this sort of highbrow messaging would be still resonant and maybe more resonant, because we don't want to be just associated with saving time. We want to be something more. But what we found, both in the pre-testing research, was that one, the more the pain point that was directly connected to their work. Was you want to do work faster, you want to do work cheaper, you want to save 3 hours of meetings a week, right? These were the things that lit up in people's brains, being like, oh, that's interesting to me, like actually interesting to me. Let me figure out how to save time. And again, it's universal. Like time is a very valuable currency for any of us. And despite the results, we said, okay, let's still put both into market and see which one does better. And it was consistent, right? When we had a messaging that was a bit more simplified or very much more tied to the actual minutia of their work, it was way more appealing to them to hear about. Because again, short term, they're like, I want to save time. Any of us does. Yeah. And that's maybe my most important thought versus innovating my work. Yeah. You know, same with Indeed. What's going to save me time to getting from 100 resumes to 10? Oh, that is the thing that I care about. Not necessarily paid jobs on newspapers or old school. You should do it digitally. Like people, especially SMB, that's not their focus. They're focused on what I can do today and quickly.
Yeah, you can still be direct in a way when you know what the pain is. I think you mentioned somewhere, I saw online, that how you recommend marketers to try and have a salesman mindset when it comes to proposing new media types. What are some of the strategies they use there?
Yeah, I think in my work and just my expertise over time, and I think my segment, there is a lot of, not suspicion, but they're not as willing to invest in offline media precisely because of the reasons we discussed.
Yeah.
It's not as easy to measure. It's not click-based. It can typically require more time to see the tangible outcomes of it. And I think in the context of B2B, a lot of the businesses that are in tech today evolved after digital marketing came to existence, where CPG, pharmaceuticals, transportation, all this have maybe a leg up. Is if you're Unilever, if you're Coca-Cola, you existed in a world where none of that was available. And so your business was built on less measurable stuff. So it's more baked in the sort of institutional acceptance that we need brand advertising or longer form advertising to work. I think when you're in tech, the bias is always going to be on performance marketing because you see results today and you have ambitious growth targets. And this is where coming into the growth mindset is important and becoming a salesperson for your organization. I think any business should, in B2B, should do offline advertising, but obviously I wouldn't go into a meeting room and say, hey, founder, I think we should stop doing paid search. We should put it all into TV because I'm getting good vibes. And obviously, offline advertising is a huge umbrella. So what I mean by sales mentality is, like any good salesperson, you're not just selling a product, you're understanding the concerns that they have, right? The objections, so that you can frame the conversation in a way that overcomes those objectives, right? I don't believe in offline, it doesn't work. It's too expensive. The anecdotal, I don't think I like it. This one's the hardest to prove against, but right, like when you go into a strategy planning session for the next year, and I'm sure a lot of us are doing that right now, go into your leadership and say, okay, what is the red line or what is the hesitation? If I say offline media, what comes to mind that tells you this is not what I want to invest in? It's not measurable, digital. And the response that I might cater to is it's not measurable in the way that paid search is or paid social is. So you're right. However, it is not true that you cannot measure it. It's just a different type of measurement. You might do geo-experimentation or like causal impact studies, right? This is not a click-based measurement style, but it's different, right? And you can build that with certain media tactics. It's too expensive, right? That could also be true, right? Again, I'm not going to go and say you should spend money on television because it's got really high CPMs, really just like flat costs. However, programmatic podcast advertising it can be $12, right? In the US, YouTube, it could be up to $20 to $25, right? So from a cost perspective, it's not always the case. Out of home could be cheaper. And then it doesn't work, right? Sentiment is hard to overcome, but it's also important to say, listen, like this is my Everest mentality. Like one of my directors taught me this. We all want to get to Everest. Everest is like the fully actualized media plan where we have millions of dollars towards search, offline, everything in between, right? And we hold space that we're not going to get here today, right? I'm not going to be successful if I go to the executive board and say, I need $10 million for TV. Anyone that climbs on Everest, people that go from sea level to Everest, they wind up not making it. right? They need to train for that. So the question is, okay, what is Basecamp, right? One.
Yeah.
Basecamp one is, I want 20 to 50K for the first quarter to test podcast advertising to see if I see signals based on geo experimentation that this channel is doing something to the business, right? Want to prove out this idea that it doesn't work. And this little inkling that something's changing might get you 150K to test a full-blown geo experiment, right? And measuring the most important sort of bottom of funnel KPI, right? And we build like this. So another thing that's important, obviously overcoming objections, but coming in with that plan. This is where I aspire for us to be. This is the vision I have in 2 to 5 years. This is how I see us getting there. This is how much I think it costs. And here's all the ways that happen if we succeed or if we don't, right? And that's another sort of key consideration. So again, to close it up, the becoming a salesperson, understanding the risk, like tolerance for your executive, understanding what objections exist here and creating the strategy that ties to them. And then again, don't just go for Everest off the bat, right? Like especially in my industry, be incremental, be focused on the stepping stones to get there. I think that's what's going to win a lot more trust with you and also just willingness to test these channels versus going flat out.
Yeah. Do you maybe sometimes do some quick tests before bringing it up to stakeholders, or it's not worth it?
I think it depends on the level of autonomy you have in your organization and what's the testing mentality of that org, right? There's different thresholds for different companies, right? Depending on what your marketing budget is. If you can spend 20K and doesn't need to go to the executive board for approval, then I work with I don't do things in a silo. Be very transparent with at least your manager about what you want to do and why. And the reason to do that is one, they can help you. And two, if someone asks, why did this money disappear? They've got your back and be like, look, it was going into something experimental, right? Like I found that doing things in the dark seldom gets you the speed and efficiency that you want, especially if it doesn't go well. Yeah. But always in a growth marketing organization, you're usually incentivized to test at speed, right? So if you can stand up a test quickly and you have a relatively good sense of how long it'll take for you to see a signal, this is for any channel. This isn't even just for offline. You're usually incentivized to come with a plan. How are you going to measure it? How long it's going to take? And you, hopefully, if your organization is pretty nimble, you can move quickly. When it comes to the offline world, again, frequency is something that can build up over time in a longer window than something digital, right? If I'm running an audio experiment, I might make the test 6 to 10 weeks just because I know it takes about 2 to 3 weeks of someone hearing radio on their car to get the maximum number of repetitions before any sort of business impact appears. So if I say 3 weeks and we see nothing, we could have prematurely cut the test without seeing the full, and then it's sustained after that. It depends. Yeah.
Awesome. I wanted to ask a bit of a selfish question. Do you see any trends in podcast advertising specifically?
In terms of advertising?
Yeah. Podcast.
I think one thing that I'm super conscious of that I think is fascinating is I think when I speak to individuals that work in the space, I think there can be a bit of a black and white mentality about, do we do host-read endorsements or do we do programmatic? Right? Host-read endorsements, obviously, you're buying that authenticity. It's baked into the episode, so it's always there. But it's harder to do geo experiments with because an episode drops for everybody. Also, the CPMs that a host will charge are typically higher, right? They might range from 20 to hundreds of dollars. It just depends on their audience size and how valuable they think their audience is. If you're doing programmatic, right, it's usually a cheaper CPM, right? I can get to $10 to $12 on a CPM. I have a lot more flexibility with my messaging and where I'm targeting. So it makes it better for, say, either really tactical regional campaigns or geo experimentation. And my messaging can change, right? So I can be more nimble with the messaging and I'll have to stay that way forever. I think there's this tension of you have to do one or the other. What I see changing is a lot more acceptance and tolerance for both to exist at the same time. There's an audio advertising machine and sponsorships helps us in one aspect and programmatic helps us with another, right? Maybe sponsorships is more your brand play and programmatic is your demand perform, right? Maybe you run both simultaneously. But I'm definitely seeing a lot more of the acceptance of both existing in the same space together, which I think is really important. And what I'm really curious about, this is like my biggest wish list for audio. There's so many,
Christmas wish.
yeah, there's so many podcasts that I don't know about that I know that my target audience is listening to. And I'm really interested to see how AI can help with the sort of sourcing of and identification of podcasts that are relevant to me and my audience. One, because I think it helps us tap into shows that we just don't know about. But I think more importantly, I think we can lift the entire industry up. There's some really strong podcast hosts, and I'm talking to one right now, right? That is just contextual keyword away from being identified by a brand. It's HubSpot for you. I'm manifesting this for you. Maybe it's HubSpot, maybe it's Product Marketing Alliance that reaches out and say, listen, like, we think your audience is really important for us to talk to. We'd love to partner with you. And I really feel like AI has a role to play to just help uplifting creators generally to a place where they can monetize their work, because it takes a lot of work to do what you're doing.
Yeah. Speaking of AI, do you use AI? And if so, what's your favorite way of using it?
Personal or for work-related things? No.
The first thing that comes to mind, actually, you're a therapist.
Oh God, my dad sent me a horoscope, and you can like upload your horoscope charts into ChatGPT, and it tells me my destiny, which is terrifying. No, but what I will do? What I actually will do from a podcast perspective is I will say, listen, if I'm hitting a wall in terms of shows that I want to explore partnerships with, I will use ChatGPT to help me understand. Hi, these are the keywords I'm looking for, or these are the audience job titles I'm looking for. Find me some podcasts. Find me the top 50 podcasts in the US or in Germany or wherever that fits this criteria.
Yeah.
And it just helps from like an idea expansion perspective, which I think is really helpful in my work. I might use it in smaller ways. Like I tend to be a lot more verbose when I'm communicating in a meeting or in a presentation. So I will also say, can I condense this? Can I be a bit more snippy with my email or my presentation? But that's what's coming to mind. So I use it for all sorts of things, but also in my personal life, if something is really complex for me to understand it, can you dumb this down for me a little bit?
Yeah, that's great, man. All right, where do you go to learn anything? What's your favorite ways of learning?
Yeah, so one, I'm curious about people and what they do. And so it is not uncommon for me to reach out to people on LinkedIn, similar stuff. So like maybe brands that do out of home that maybe aren't my direct target audience. Like, hey, I've reached out to several people about out of home in different industries, just out of my own curiosity, because I'm curious how they're getting buy-in to do these channels and everyone's really different, right? But it's helping me understand to be better at objective selling, leadership.
Yeah.
So talking to people and just like asking that question, because I think we forget that on LinkedIn, like we can reach out to people and ask them what they're doing.
That's true.
We're like always searching on Google, or I can just talk to a person with the job near the.
It's because we're all afraid of the pitch slap, I think.
A little flattery helps. It goes a long way. So I will do that. I am like religiously asking ChatGPT, hey, I'm trying to get more skills on X. What are some good articles or resources? Always helps me. And then coworkers, I'm naturally curious and I like the idea of being more of a T-shaped marketer. So I will go to someone in product marketing and be like, hey, what courses or what resources do you think are useful for your work?
Nice.
Yeah, what are my teams doing in brand?
Yeah. Also, thank you so much, Brandon. It's been super, super insightful and eye-opening, especially because I basically have no idea how offline media works. So
yeah,
it's been super insightful. Thank you so much. Where can people find your LinkedIn? I get. And what else?
Yeah, so if you have questions, you can follow me on LinkedIn. So that's linkedin.com/Lutz Brandon. So it's my last name and my first name.
I will link to it.
And then if you have other questions, you can reach out to my email. So that's lutz.brandonjames@gmail.com.
All right. Awesome, Brenda. Thank you so much for listening to the pod. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, the best thing you could do to support the show and help me as a small business owner would be to leave a review. Head over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and let me know what you think. If you don't want to miss future episodes, subscribe, and if you have any feedback, questions, or suggestions for future episodes, just hit me up on LinkedIn at Christopher Silvestri or Twitter at SilvestriChris. Speak to you next time.